Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 11. The Mutation Effect. The alchemist sat in the observation area of the sunroom watching his subject. The alchemist had arrived at the town hall immediately after sunset on the 13th to ensure that the subject had not escaped during the day. He was certain the windows would hold up to the subject's strength just in case he got violent, but he knew there was a chance that humans would pass by the window, causing the subject to jump at them. It was a risk like so many others he had taken, but since it was impossible to transfer the subject back to the enclosed room, he was forced to take it. The subject had jumped at the glass partition when the alchemist entered the room, indicating the subject's intelligence had decreased into animalistic tendencies. The alchemist had only left the room once, and upon his re-entry, the subject had leapt against the glass again. Since then, he had paced back and forth in the holding chamber, his shoulders hunched over, looking at the alchemist hungrily. The alchemist believed his previous subject had died due to a lack of blood, and wondered how long this one could survive without a fresh victim. With this critical question unanswered, Vladimir was due to arrive this evening, and he considered how he would display the subject to Vladimir when he arrived. He would recommend that Vladimir's guards stand ready to hold the subject just in case the subject's animal nature remained dominant. While the Tepish leaders had taken samples of the new serum, the alchemist felt that the serum needed more tests and refinement to try to retain the recipient's intelligence. Otherwise, they would have a dangerous army that would be unable to discern ally from enemy. Given their relative impatience, however, he feared that the Tepish leadership would ignore his words. He shook his head. He had come so far in what he had made, and now, after 8 years of research and testing, his first surviving subject was turning into an animal. He glanced at the clock in the room that rested on a table against the wall between the glass and the room's entrance. It had been roughly 2 hours since nightfall. He knew Vladimir would have left Aram as soon as the sun went down, so he would be arriving very shortly. The alchemist had instructed Obadiah to see Vladimir to the secret section of the hall as soon as he arrived. He dreaded having to tell Vladimir that the serum still needed more work. He looked back at the subject and noticed that the animal condition was worsening. In the past few minutes, the subject had gone from pacing on his feet with hunched shoulders to pacing on his hands and feet. Fearing the worst, the alchemist stood up and spoke to the subject. "Excuse me," the alchemist began. The subject elicited no sign that he heard or understood the alchemist. He knew that sound could penetrate the glass wall since it was open at the top. "Can you show that you understand what I'm saying?" he asked. The subject just kept pacing. The alchemist thought quickly. He wanted to rule out the possibility that the subject had lost his hearing as well. The alchemist cleared his throat and tried to remember how, in his younger days, he had made a sound like an animal roar. It was a rough sound then, and would probably be so now, but it would likely get the subject's attention. He let out a guttural sound like a cross between a roar and a sick growl. It made no difference, though, as the subject suddenly leapt for the glass again and slammed hard against it. The alchemist was so surprised that he took several steps backward. At the very least, it proved that the new Fempiror could still hear, as worthless as it may be for them in this state. The door at the end of the hall opened. That would be Obadiah escorting Vladimir to the subject's room. The alchemist opened the door to the hall just as the footfalls reached him. Vladimir, dressed in the red and black armor of the Tepish, passed into the room with 3 escorts and Obadiah. "Welcome, Vladimir," the alchemist said. "I received the information back from our last messenger that your subject ate well," Vladimir said. "Yes, sir," the alchemist said. "He is progressing almost as predicted." "Explain almost," Vladimir requested. "Well," the alchemist began, "it seems that the serum is not yet perfect." He pointed to the subject, back to pacing on all fours and staring. "You see, for some reason, the subject is reverting into an animalistic mindset. He jumped at me when I entered. He doesn't understand language. He is even walking on his hands. And what is the problem with that? Vladimir asked. Well, if he has no concept of friend and enemy, the alchemist explained, then there's a high risk of him turning on us. The goal of this mutation is to destroy both our enemies and humanity, Vladimir said shortly. The less conscience they have, the better. It's not so much a matter of conscience, the alchemist began. You've done well here, Vladimir interrupted. Thank you, sir, the alchemist responded, a little flustered. He did not understand why Vladimir was so unconcerned with this problem. No need to be modest, Vladimir continued. Your insight broke the code that eluded our poor trapped brains for so long. I have done what I could to serve the Tepish, the alchemist said. I'm just afraid that we have 2 more tests to try, Vladimir interrupted again. The alchemist was confused. No one made him aware of any additional tests, nor had the Tepish leadership requested any. Before he could respond again, Vladimir snapped his fingers at one of his guards. The guard reached into a satchel on his belt and removed a Neolrof, the 2-pronged device that the Tepish have used for centuries for transmutation. The alchemist could see only 2 ways this would go, and he hoped for only one of them. Vladimir took the device and stabbed it into the guard's neck to withdraw a cylinder full of blood. What are you doing? The alchemist asked. Let us see which is stronger, Vladimir said. Yours or Voivode's? I would suggest your guards going first to restrain him, just in case, the alchemist warned. Certainly, Vladimir said, unflinching. He snapped his fingers and gestured for his guard to go ahead of them. The alchemist opened the door to the glass enclosure. The subject charged at them, but the guards grabbed him by the arms and lifted him off the ground. He struggled against them to no avail. Vladimir raised the Neolrof and stabbed it into the subject's neck. The subject winced at the injection, but as soon as Vladimir withdrew the Neolrof needles, he struggled again. They watched him for a long moment, but nothing happened. His fruitless struggle continued, but nothing else changed. Vladimir stepped back and smiled, his face betraying honest surprise. Amazing, he exclaimed. You have defeated the original serum. Thank you, the alchemist humbly replied. He had not considered this particular test, but he was grateful that the test met with Vladimir's satisfaction. And now to see how yours will affect us, Vladimir said, as he plunged the Neolrof back into the subject and withdrew a cylinder full of blood. He turned back to the guard who was not holding the subject and stabbed the Neolrof into his neck. The guard stared in shock as the needles punctured his neck, and Vladimir depressed the pump to force the subject's blood into the guard. What are you doing? The alchemist asked in shock. He wasn't a test subject. Of the 2 tests, he had hoped for only the first. Like the first test, this less desirable one could go either way, but the guard had not volunteered for this. He is now, Vladimir said, watching. The guard fell to his knees. The other 2, still holding the subject, stepped back in surprise as the stabbed guard held his neck, hyperventilating. Was that test authorized? The alchemist asked. Vladimir grabbed the alchemist's shirt and held him close to his face. Everything I do is authorized, Vladimir said angrily. Never forget that. He pushed the alchemist away. Conflict raged within him. Vladimir had injected that guard with the new serum without the guard's knowledge. No one knew the full ramifications of this serum yet. It was one thing to attack humans, since humanity would kill them if they could, but to change another Fempiror, especially one who had pledged his allegiance to the Tepish, bordered on treason in the alchemist's mind. Perhaps Vladimir felt that no one was off limits to him. He looked back at the guard. The guard stared at them in shock. Sweat poured down his face. He closed his eyes and opened his mouth in a silent scream of pain. His canines elongated as they watched. His face drained of color as his blood dissolved in his veins. Finally, a scream broke free from his mouth before he collapsed on the ground. The alchemist looked at Obadiah, who shared his look of horror at this new revelation. His gaze passed to Vladimir, whose surprise melted into a wide smile of wonder on his face. The alchemist had never seen him look so happy. Impressive, Vladimir said. 10 days in humans, but 10 seconds in Fempiror. Imagine the possibilities. We could capture the Rostim and just change them. He laughed at the very idea. We could force them to turn against their core beliefs. Watch him, he said seriously, his tone changing instantly. Let us know if you find anything else worthy to report. Was this subject created using the most recent serum you sent to Aram? Yes, sir, the alchemist replied shakily, shifting his eyes to Vladimir. Excellent, Vladimir said. Then we have enough mutations to not require any further duplication of your synthesized serum. Mutations? Is that what the Tepish were going to call his creation? He could acknowledge that the name was appropriate enough. He had started his research on the original serum and changed it little by little as he worked. In the end, it was a mutation of the original, and it also served to describe their mental state. Then he realized that Vladimir spoke of more than one mutation. The alchemist now had two, but was that all? Enough mutations, the alchemist asked. How many are there? With your subject and our ex-guard here, about a dozen, Vladimir told him very matter-of-factly. A dozen, the alchemist said in shock. He thought they had only wanted to analyze the serum he sent, or perhaps use a test subject of their own. He had no idea they were administering it already. Now that they knew it turned to Fempiror almost instantly, he feared the mutation number would grow exponentially. Yes, we wanted to test it on a larger scale, and as yours was 1 day older, you were able to give us some advanced information to prepare for. Our subjects from the latest batch have all recovered after their 3-day coma just like yours, and stand ready. They also behave like animals, though I can tell you that they have responded well to me, and they have not attacked each other, Vladimir said. Your work here is almost done. You're a credit to the Tepish Order, and you will be rewarded if this goes well. Thank you, the alchemist said flatly to Vladimir. Vladimir and the alchemist left the sunroom. The guards walked to the doorway, still holding the subject. They tossed him against a far wall and quickly walked through the door, closing it rapidly behind them. The subject leapt quickly across the room and hit the glass. The guards and Obadiah jumped on impact, but neither Vladimir nor the alchemist moved. He knew Vladimir expected it, and the alchemist was too numb at this point to even acknowledge it. Vladimir and his guards, along with Obadiah, left the alchemist alone with his thoughts. They had already used his serum without his knowledge. People were being actively changed into animals that required blood in order to survive. Instinct took over to the point where they no longer based their actions on any level of sentient reason. He had reduced his subject to pure animalistic tendencies already, and he knew the guard would be the same way within a few days of his awakening, if it even took days. The mind slowly slipped away. He had given the Tepish their army of mindless killers, and they did not care that this army might turn on them at any moment. To make matters worse, these killers had blood that would not only change a human in 2 weeks' time, but it would change a Fempiror within an hour. He reasoned that the mutation and Fempiror individual physiologies were similar enough to accelerate the process, though he did not fully understand why. And he suspected he would not have the opportunity to research why, or modify the serum to perhaps not change a Fempiror. It no longer mattered. He glanced back at the fruits of his labor and noticed the subject was sniffing at the guard, but not attacking him in any way. As he watched, the subject turned his gaze to the alchemist, and the alchemist finally saw a shred of emotion. The subject smiled. The alchemist cursed himself for what he had done. Vladimir was right. His work here was complete, whether he liked it or not. He had done what the Tepish had asked of him, and now he started to regret it.